Thank you. All right. So it's great to be back here. I was here last year, and I realized last year my talk was at the end of the day, and I had the dread of the end. Now I have the dread of the last one before lunch. So I'm going to ensure that I keep you on track, because there's some great food here for those who haven't been here. Thank you all for being here today. As we can see, I'm going to change the tact a bit. We're going to talk a little less technical. I know we had a couple of technical talks, and more talk about a leadership level and how we as leaders and as executives really cover the challenge of telling what we need to tell. Much of our job has to do with giving information, providing advice, asking for money. But there are a lot of challenges to that. And so I'm hoping with this session today that we're going to learn a couple techniques that are going to help us. It's all about storytelling. So, of course, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today has to do with stories. So, like every good story, once upon a time. So, once upon a time for me, for those who remember, once upon a time, I wasn't in cyber. I was actually a street paramedic. I'm from Canada, in Toronto particularly. I spent 10 years on the streets of Toronto as a paramedic. I spent 4 years as a flight paramedic flying around all over North America. And for whatever reason, I don't know what it was, I ended up out of that field and into cybersecurity. So 25 years, more or less, I kind of started counting because when I did it, I started at one point talking about how I started cyber in the last century, and that really didn't go well with my age topic. So a lot of major corporations that I've worked for, and as mentioned, the last many years, I have been founder and CEO of RiskAware, providing services to organizations related to risk. So how did we get here? Well, you know, we are in a world where a lot has changed. I honestly can tell you, in the years that I have been engaged in cybersecurity, a lot has changed. The world has become far more difficult, and we're hearing that already today. You probably all know that. But we have new technologies, we have new threat actors, we have new methodologies. We have things we never thought of before that are being used against us to target us, and it becomes a challenge. And as someone in cybersecurity, as we know, our job is to be protecting that. And we do it as best we can, but there's always the new piece that emerges, which is, how do we tell our bosses? How do we tell our leaders? How do we tell our companies what cybersecurity is all about? And how do we get what we need? We are being asked more and more by our senior leaders and by our boards on what is happening, what are we doing, how are we stopping it, how safe are we? And the always friendly but stern, could this happen to us? All of them are pieces that, if you don't tell the right story, you may run into challenges either with conveying the right message, getting the right support, getting the resourcing and the funding that you need. And the Caymans are not immune to all of this, by no means, right? We've seen enough, we heard about, and we know that attacks are here like they are everywhere else. I don't think there's a corner of the world that has internet connection that isn't safe from the world of cybersecurity. But we know that it is part of our day-to-day tasks. Now, early on, very, very early on in my career, my first story for you has to do with one of my first instances and how I kind of got into cybersecurity. I went from being a paramedic into straight IT before I went into cybersecurity. I worked for a small financial company, and we had some DBAs. We ran a very large database with all customer information. And one day they showed it to me. They said, Michael, come over and take a look. And they showed me on the screen all these accounts and how much money each of the customers had. A big no-no, we would say. And they showed me how easy it would be, hypothetically, to change any value in this database to any number that they wanted because they had the power. I found it quite fascinating. I went to my boss one day, I mentioned that. I said, we really need to do something about that. She says, well, do you know how? I'm like, no, not really, but I'm sure we can figure that out. And next thing you know, I was in cybersecurity. So that's how some of us back in the day entered into this wonderful field. But more importantly, though, once I got into cybersecurity, I started to work for some of these large organizations. And even then, so we're talking about the early 2000s, cybersecurity, internet security, whatever we called it back then, really was not anywhere as sophisticated as it is today. In fact, I sat in a little corner, had a team of two, I was part of a team of two, and access management, password control, content filtering for web traffic was big. And I remember having a meeting with my director of IT, reported into IT at the time, and I wanted to show him and talk about antivirus and start to talk about the stats and talk about how we were doing with patch. So I had my slides all together. I started talking about it. He nodded his head a lot. And then when I finished, he said, Michael, that's great, but you didn't tell me what I needed to know. And I said, well, what was that? He said, how many people in the business are surfing porn? That, to him, was the function of my job, was to tell him regularly how many people. Now, it was an oil company. There were a lot of people up in the plants, and he didn't care about security. He just wanted to have his porno report. That's what he called it. And so from then on, every month, slide 2 in my presentation was the top 20 people surfing porn. Suffice to say, that is not the best story, of course, on how we do this, but it really emphasizes kind of how we need to adjust what we do to accommodate the audience that we need to talk to. So we know the why. We already talked about it. The why I want everyone to understand the messaging of the piece. How do we get there? Well, we first have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. So how do we set the scene, right? We need to understand what are the pain points and what is it that we want to solve and when we have these conversations. How do we spark organization-wide action? Now, this one is tough because we know cybersecurity can be a tough sell, not only up the chain, but down the chain as well. And how can we, as leaders, transform abstract cyber risk to something tangible and something that's meaningful? And the answer to that is storytelling. So what I want to take us through here is the art of storytelling, where you become the chief storyteller officer. So there are a lot of great things about storytelling, and actually there's a lot to learn behind this. There's science behind the aspect of storytelling. It's a very, very powerful tool that we use to engage, we use to inspire, and we can use to motivate the audience that we have. The science behind it is that the scientists in their lab coats will tell you that the brain's sensory cortex allows listeners, when they're listening to a story, to experience that story in a more powerful way, in a more memorable way, than if you just talked dollars and cents, statistics, data, or metrics. And advertisers, as we know today, excuse me, advertisers today have already started using storytelling in a lot of ways in how they get brand recognition out. So we look at the likes of Nike, Adidas, Apple. You look at the commercials on TV. They don't put up a shoe. They don't show you a new iPhone. They tell you the story behind the product that they want to sell, and that resonates very well. So I want to show a quick video here, one of the classics, as an example of the storytelling and its impact that it had. This is from Apple. If you remember back in the 80s, Apple was trying to launch themselves, become a little bit more mainstream. Before then, Apple and anybody that had an Apple computer kind of sheltered in the geek world of computing. But everything changed in the Super Bowl of 1984, if we can show that clip.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory thoughts. Unification, of course, is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
So if you don't recognize that, that was they were playing on the George Orwell novel 1984, which was all about control. This commercial played during the Super Bowl of that year. Within 100 days, Apple sold, I just captured the 72,000 computers. Now, this is an era where people did not have computers in their homes. And this commercial, this branding, launched Apple into mainstream as we have today. So, just like last year, every time I give a talk, I always use a Stephen Covey quote. And the quote for today's presentation is, begin with the end in the mind. Begin with the end in mind, my apologies. So how we resonate that to where we're talking about is we're storytelling. And one of the key successes that I've always used when I tell stories is always start at the end. And what I mean by that is you have to have a goal, you have to have that ask that is at the end of your conversation. What is it? Decide what that's going to be and then work backwards, because that is going to help you paint the picture on where you want to go. So, what I want to share with you today is what I kind of come up with is the storytelling framework for leaders today, and most resoundingly within the cyber space. There really are four pieces that I want us to focus on. The first one is understand your audience. So know who you're talking to and why, and what the goal is will lead you to some effective storytelling. The second point is to be authentic. Now, being authentic means being the person that is truly you and sharing the good or the bad with what you want to tell them, but saying it in an honest and truthful way, not hiding and not avoiding. The third one, and we probably all do it already today, is use data and metrics. But what we're going to talk about is how to use data and metrics, because a good storyteller has their pictures and has their points to show, but we all know that we have to use it appropriately and effectively if we want to get our message across. And the last of the 4 points is on nurturing continuous culture. And this is leveraging a shift through communication, through adaptation, and through understanding. So let's dive into these. So first off, understanding your audience. So in order to make cybersecurity really effective and in your stories that you're hopefully starting to think of, is you have to be engaging and relevant to your audience. It's no point going into a room of salespeople and talking nothing but cybersecurity stats. Your message will just not get conveyed across. So it's important to understand um, the perspective of what you want to talk about, the perspective and the reality of the group that you're speaking to, because ultimately you want to motivate them. Your message, whether it is about talking about what's happening or what could happen, if it's about motivating them to do training or education, you have to find a way to get through, and one of those ways is understanding all about them. So I want you to focus on their areas of interest. So know what really gets them riled up. So use the example of finance people. What riles finance people up? Well, if we start talking dollars and cents and we start talking about income and bottom line, they love that talk. So we as cyber people have to find a way that we're going to make that our conversation match that one. And we want to tailor that format to the story so the audience understands that and understands our preferences. And again, using data and metrics is one way to do that. But we definitely want to tailor the story so that it fits that format. So let me tell you another story. So as part of my many roles and hats that I've worn over the many years, I was in an organization that felt compelled that the organization really needed to go out and seek ISO certification, 27001. So for those that don't know, I'm sure most of you do, ISO certification, like SOC 2 and many others, is really a measurement, a certification whereby an organization can truly show to some level what their position is related to security within the organization. Now, for those who've gone through an ISO prep and ultimately an ISO audit, it's no fun. It's a lot of work. It is a lot of expense. But there are reasons why organizations do it. So for this particular organization, I knew that they were going to balk at the price and the effort because it was going to take new processes, new documentation, not just writing them, but enforcing them and putting them into play, the cost of preparing for the audit, and the cost of the audit itself. So when I got into the room, I knew that there'd be some challenge. And when I entered the room, we had a few people in the room. Instead of seeing a room full of leaders and decision makers, instead I saw and pictured a room of parents, parents with children, potentially younger children. And so I crafted my story to be about that. So what did I do? Well, I started to talk about and asking them how they, either in the past or currently or in the future, how would they go about to choose a daycare for their preschooler? And they kind of looked at me, and I said, well, you probably go out and you're going to do your research. You're going to go to the daycares. You're going to interview the childcare educators. You're going to inspect the place. You're going to talk to other parents. You are going to do some research, and you are going to come up with a decision that's going to help you pick the best daycare for your child, one that you are going to trust. There's a lot of responsibility for a daycare. So I said, turn that around now and look at organizations that are going to look upon us. I said, our customers are going to look to us, and we were in the business of selling information, but it involves a lot of the information of our customers. They're going to look to us, and they're going to want to know that we, our company, are trustworthy. And they're going to want to look to us to ensure that we are doing everything, that we are passing good reviews, that we can show, we can demonstrate that we are doing what we need to do to protect their data and their information. I said, the way we're going to do that is we need to go get ISO certified. And the talk and the nodding heads allowed me to realize that people understood that analogy that I'd built and understood that, hey, if we as an organization have this certification, that we're going to have something that's going to allow us to show and prove to our customers. And sure enough, the talk changed from a cost center and an overcost to an opportunity for our organization. So again, understand your audience. As I mentioned, if you're talking to the finance team, it's all about dollars and cents and bottom line. If you're talking to salespeople, it's all about revenue. If you're talking to IT, hey, it's all about tech, and they want to have that technology talk. But if you're talking to the boards or you're talking to those executive leaders, well, I can tell you it's going to be a mixed bag. I've been in front of many, many boards. But it's all about company value for them. And of course, for them, the big conversation piece is all about risk. So I'm a big Seinfeld fan. I don't know how many of you watch Seinfeld. I still watch it. I've seen all the episodes, have all the DVDs. And it's sad that I relate many things in my life to a scene that happens in a Seinfeld episode. So I wanted to share a couple minutes, I think it's 4 minutes long, of a clip from one of the episodes. It was called Risk Management.
Listen, I gotta get some reading done. You mind if I do this here? I can't concentrate in my apartment.
Risk management?
Yeah. Steinbrenner wants everyone in the front office to give a lecture in their area of business expertise.
Well, what makes them think you're a risk management expert?
I guess it's on my resume.
Hello?
Please hold for Elaine Bennis.
You know what? I can't do this. I can't read books anymore. Books on tape have ruined me, Jerry. I need that nice voice. This book has my voice. I hate my voice.
So get this book on tape.
You can't. It's a textbook. Excuse me. I'm sorry to bother you. I noticed that you have a textbook on tape. May I ask where you got that?
Reading for the blind. They can get any book on tape.
I tell you, I am hooked on these books on tape.
Don't tell me about it. These things have ruined me for Braille.
Reading for the blind?
I take an eye test, I flunk it. The next thing you know, I am swinging to the sweet sounds of risk management.
Chapter 1. In order to manage risk, we must first understand risk. How do you spot risk? How do you avoid risk? And what makes it so risky?
This guy sounds just like me.
To understand risk, we must first define
This is
risk.
horrible.
Risk has existed virtually.
Stop it. We got a big problem here, Jerry. The tapes are worthless.
Kind of in the middle of something here, George. George,
I gotta run anyway.
I can't believe you feel you really need a mentor.
I just need someone who can give me some kind of direction. I'll see ya.
I see. So what's your problem?
No problem.
And you're sure with your busy schedule you'd have time to take on a protege?
I'll make time. Because, Abby, I was once like you. Wide-eyed, naive. I didn't know the first thing about a subject as fundamental as risk management.
I'm not familiar with that. You'll have to explain it to me.
I'll tell you what. Why don't you read this book, and let's just see if you can explain it to me. Okay.
George Costanza is your mentor?
Yeah, he's great. I am learning so much.
About what? How to calculate 5% of a restaurant check?
You know what your problem is? You just have no respect for the protege-mentor relationship.
As a matter of fact, I happen to have a protege of my own.
Who?
I'm Mr. Kenneth Banya.
Banya?
I'm going to mentor this kid to the top.
Hey, Jerry,
Banya.
I just stopped by to thank you. That risk management stuff you wrote for me is killer.
Risk management?
It's gold, Jerry, gold. I got all these corporate gigs, and even Cynthia took me back.
Our next speaker is George Costanza on the subject of risk management.
Ovaltine. Have you ever had this stuff? Why do they call it Ovaltine? You should call it Roundtine. You know what I'm talking about.
He's my protege.
So, what do we take from this story? Well, first off, George is a horrible storyteller, and that risk management is a really, really dry subject. And George, in this case, doesn't understand his audience. Risk in this case is really the story, right? It's not always for the CISO leader to talk about technology or talk about breaches. Risk has become that fundamental topic that seems to be resonating with many of our audiences. So in this case, you are the George, but you have to find a way to be able to break through in those conversations. The second point is on being authentic. So what does this really mean? Well, as I kind of mentioned already, this is about being truthful, being honest, telling a story, whether it's good or bad, and being able to convey that type of information. Now, fundamentally, as talkers to cybersecurity, I can tell you there were times in my career when I spoke to leaders and I wasn't an authentic person. I lived in the world of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, the FUD principle. And that was where I, as a leader, would go to my executives, go to who I had to tell the story, and impel fear upon them and doubt that if they didn't spend money, if they didn't provide another resource, if they didn't get going on something, that something bad would happen to our organization. And those stories really, really were the only way to get through. It was a shameful time, I'll tell you, in my career. But that's what you had to do. Your messaging with a low cost center and no ROI was on the negative approach that if you do not do something, something bad will happen to us. Well, I'll tell you that that is not the way that we need to tell stories today. We really need to focus on that authenticity and being truthful versus trying the scare tactics of the past. We also have to focus on not being denial, not being living in a world of rose-colored glasses, but really talking about where we are, what is happening, and sometimes that involves telling stories that are good, and sometimes those involve telling stories that are not so good. I find as a leader, a lot of it has to be with being yourself and being vulnerable even at times to show that something can happen. But the key thing and what resonates with your audience when you're telling stories is your honesty, your relatability, and having a story that says that maybe things are okay, but they could be better. If we go back, oops, did I go the wrong way? There we go. If we go back to this slide, which I showed earlier, we can look where any of these stories, we could use that FUD principle pretty well. We could set a doom and gloom here on the islands on what is happening and what could be, and tell a story and show these stories on a negative approach as to fundamentally what's happening to cybersecurity on the island. But I would argue that these actually can be used effectively and more positively, because any one of these stories could speak to the capabilities of our institutions, our government, and our organizations on this island. We could speak to the success stories that have been had, and John mentioned that in his talk with the attack earlier this year on the government infrastructure. And so we need to take the positives if we're going to use stories like this and share them in a way that's going to resonate with our people. Exposure can be a strength for us, and we really want to use that in our dialogue as we thinking of the end to where we want to go in our story. I've lived through many cyber attacks through my career. Many of them have been DDoS attacks. I know Marcel talked about the huge attacks that we have. I remember one of the attacks that I had brought down a critical web application that we had in our organization. And we were having a really tough time in combating it. We just didn't have the tools. The Cloudflares did not exist in the time. The CIO came over and he asked me, he said, is this going to stop soon? And my answer to him wasn't, of course it will, or yes, sir, we are right on it. My answer to him, my story was, I don't know. I don't know when this is going to stop. I don't know if we can ever get it to stop, but we're trying our best. We're using our tools. We've engaged with our service providers. The telecoms are involved. We are doing everything that we can. And those were the stories that made the CIO leave me alone for the next couple hours. And luckily in this case, the attack stopped, and then we were able to put in some controls thereafter. I think I missed a slide. Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. The third piece I want to talk about is data metrics. So, as I mentioned, we all use it. I use data and metrics almost every single day in my career now. It's a great way of telling a story. But the key to using data metrics, of course, is that you need it to support your narrative, not to be your narrative. You need to still create and craft that compelling story, and you need to inject the information and inject those samples where you can. Gone are the days, I think, of just throwing up a slide full of data points, a slide of bar graphs, and showing monthly reports, month over month, of how we are doing with our patching scenarios, how we are doing with training. Because when we show those slides at every board meeting or at every meeting with the executive, the message will get lost very, very quickly, because it becomes very, very hard to understand what it says and what it means to say. So I used to have slides like that. Again, a long career before the world of storytelling came clear to me. I once had slides, and the two of the key slides that I would show was that kind of line graph with antivirus stats. And we'd show what percentage of our systems were patched, and then one month we had a number that suddenly there was a dip, and of course it caught the eye of my boss, and they're like, well, why is this down? Does this mean that we are now ineffectively doing our job? I'm like, well, no, we had a little glitch. There's a little bug. We didn't report for a few days, so it didn't show. Well, you can argue that's a good thing or it's a bad thing. It's bad because I'm showing bad stats, but it was good because at least I got him to ask the question. But the momentum was lost in terms of what I was trying to tell. The next month, I showed a different slide, and this one was on antivirus, and we saw a surge in quarantined items. And again, my boss said, what is this? Does this mean we're having more attacks? Are we in trouble now? I said, well, no. It was a really busy month, and we actually saw more attacks than we typically do. This spike on our little bar graph. But I said everything's okay, and it led to a conversation about the highs and lows of attacks on our organization. How, following that, we were able to show that the quarantine was effective, and it was kind of meeting the lines of the level of viruses that we had. So the viruses were actually getting quarantined versus not getting quarantined, and ending up on the machines. But it really was a stat that I really didn't like showing, because in its raw form, it was very ineffective and it was telling the wrong story. So what I suggest is consider losing the old style of slides, of just metrics and stats, and start focusing a little more on the visualization of your storytelling, because those visual effects really can play that important role in what your story that you're telling. Remember, you want it to be part of your story, not be a replacement of your story, but it really can help, again, with the retention capabilities and the relatability of it. Remember, it's one thing to talk about metrics, it's another to show them. So this is not a class on good metrics versus bad metrics. We could do a whole session on that. But these are the type of stats that would just cringe at now. I mean, we have bar graphs that you can't tell what's good and bad. We have pie charts that are, numerical versus percentages. How is anybody supposed to understand that, let alone want to understand what cybersecurity is? So we need to move away from that and have compelling information for us. We need them, as I mentioned, to complement our story. They need to assist and answer the questions that we want answered, or at the very least, the questions that we want them to ask of us. So we want to be prepared, we want to build those out, and we want to show them. Now, again, this is just an example. I'm not going to break it down, but here very much metrics and slides that talk about risk to organization, talk about risk around the organization, talking about maturity, excuse me, and to talk about stuff that for your audience, depending on who they are, they will get a better grasp than just showing where we've been and where we need to go. All of these types of conversations, these type of metrics can lead to those conversations that you want to have, to lead to that need for more resourcing or funding or approving a budget for something to do. And it's paramount that, again, that we show those metrics versus just standing and talking numbers to your organization. The last point that I want to talk about is on nurturing continuous culture. Now, culture has always been a part of storytelling, because it really, cultures have always used storytelling as a shared sense of responsibility, of accountability, of belonging, and a connection to the bigger purpose that we have. It really is part of understanding the broader sense of responsibility that cybersecurity has in the broader case of your organization or the audience that you want to talk to. You need to show that cybersecurity is not an island, and you definitely need to show that it is not the only island in the world that we want to talk about. It's important that you understand and that you can convey that cybersecurity fits into the business at hand. You have to convey, as that leader, that you understand what that business is and that you are part of the solution versus the challenge that goes through there that is going to stop or potentially disrupt that business from doing what it has to do. So you want to build your storytelling, build your cybersecurity into the pieces that will enable you to inject cybersecurity into the broader piece. So, what do I mean by that? Well, when you're talking, always make sure that they understand that you understand why you're in business. I worked for the largest grocery chain retailer in Canada, and I, of course, talked cybersecurity. And I remember some point in my career, the CEO talked to a group of us, and he said, do you know what we do? And everyone said, well, we sell groceries and we distribute food. He says, we sell tomatoes. That is what we do. We sell tomatoes. Why he would say that, I didn't understand. But it made me, through reflection, understand that I needed to resonate to the CEO, be able to inject where cybersecurity fits in the storyline of tomatoes. And that is not necessarily an easy thing, but a lot of my conversations became about supply chain on getting tomatoes to market, the ability to ensure that the distribution wasn't impacted by a cyber attack that would prevent the tomatoes from making it to the stores. Talked about IoT attacks and distribution and refrigeration of those tomatoes, and those were the ways that my piece fit into the culture of that particular organization. So the last story I want to tell you today is something that probably all of you are very familiar with in the challenges of what we do our job, and we've talked about it already and heard about it, is on awareness. So when we talk about culture, we have to be very clear that our talk isn't always upwards. Our point of being a storyteller isn't always going up the chain and convincing our leaders and our decision makers. It's always going to be a two-way street. And that also means downwards, talking to our customers, our employees, and our staff. And one of the ways, of course, that we have to do that in our jobs as security practitioners often is on security awareness and on helping the organization. So with cultures of a finance company or a grocery retailer or a pharmaceutical, whatever your organization is, you have to understand that everybody in that organization has a job. Everybody has something that is why they're there, why they're getting paid, and they have accountability and responsibility in there. And it's not easy to come in and just start talking about cybersecurity, say, hey, you need to take training, everything hinges on you, you are the weakest link. It's blah, blah that they don't want to hear. So instead, we have to take an approach of the concept of it takes a village to protect your organization. So how I tackled that in my organization and have used subsequently is to really start to leverage where cybersecurity fits in everyone's job. And the only way to understand that is to go talk to people. Talking, embedding yourself and your team and the concept of cybersecurity within those groups, talking to the sales teams, the distribution teams, the finance teams, the marketing teams, whatever pieces of the organization is getting down and speaking with them, getting to understand what their world is, and then making it relatable to what they do. So your relation to marketing is on, where social engineering and social media, it can impact marketing in a negative way, and the importance of those teams to understand that and craft their dialogue and protect their platforms so that that can't happen. It's about going and talking to people in the warehouses on the need for them to, even in a limited capacity of dealing with email and the like, they still have to be mindful that when they do things that, they don't have as much exposure. So taking the training is more paramount than ever because it really keys in on key things that they may not see often, but may suddenly see in the times that they work. The village becomes the organization. You are just that person that helps within that village. But in this case, it is everyone in the organization as we talk about it. It takes the whole organization in order to deal with cyber threats. We know that it just doesn't start and end with you as a practitioner, but you need everybody to be a part of that. So, we need to change the storylines. You need to think about how you're going to convey your messages, both up and down, how you're going to convey your messages, how you're going to tell your next storyline. There's a lot of trial and error on it, I can tell you that. As I said, I've had a lot of failures in my messaging through my career. But what resonates now is that ability to be understanding of your audience, to be authentic, to use effective metrics and data, and to work within the continuous culture of your organization. So, some final thoughts. So remember that when you're talking, you can't just talk about cybersecurity. I know we need to talk about cybersecurity. It is part of our job to be embedded in the notion of cybersecurity, but we cannot have conversations that are only about ourselves. We have to go beyond that. We need to lead our stories with conviction, with clarity, with unity, and with inspiration. We have to be able to tell that story in a way that is going to want them to listen, in a way that's going to get them to understand, and it's a way that you're going to get to the end, and that end being either an ask for something, a support for something, or just clarity and relativity to the people in the room as it is to your conversation. Humanizing all of this is very big to that. Again, being reflective. You're not Superman, Wonder Woman. You are just another piece of that cog, but your accountability is for cybersecurity. But it relates to every other journey within your organization. And if you become effective at this and you start telling these stories well, you will get heard, you will start to get understood, and you will start to get through to your audience and start to see some results. So, a key thing as that storyteller, of course, is on trust. We're not talking about zero trust or trusted networks. We're talking about the trust as a human, and that value that's going to resonate. If your audience can trust you, if they can have confidence in you, if they can relate to you and have some level of respect and understanding, your messaging, those neuroscientists are going to be right. You are going to be able to get through and have that audience understand the message that you want to say beyond just the point fact deliverable that you want to have in your message. So my question then for you as we close off then is, what will be your story? And how will you, as you take away, kind of be your messaging going forward? So I hope all this helped. I hope it is informative. Thank you for listening. Anyone have any questions? I know your tummies are growling, so everyone's like, if I put up my hand, it's going to delay us getting to the warm food. So, very good. And thanks, everybody. Enjoy your lunch.
Okay, just a quick bit of administration for you. Thank you very much for the presentation. The only quibble I'll have is it's tomato, not tomato, just as a matter of policy.
Fair enough.